Well, it is true. I think it's right that as far back as we can look in history to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, to the Hebrew conquests of Canaan, and so on, every every group believed that their success was that God was on their side. When Britain became the dominant power in the 19th century, it didn't say, well, we were lucky we had the steam engine. Now we can kick the shit out of everyone else. They said, well, we are the great civilization. And the fact that we have the steam engine means either A, B, C, or D. We are superior genetically, we are superior culturally, we are God's choice, we are the new Israel, whatever you want, and that's the multiple choice question. But it's always some confirmation of superiority. So this is, again, I think, pretty deep-seated culturally. It manifests itself in different ways, but why doesn't it self-correct? Well, I think one thing, and it's, for me, I believe my lucky life experience and professional experience is that early on I decided I wanted to work on the issues of economic development because I thought, why do we have poverty still? This is a wealthy world. And so I spent most of my time looking at the United States from the outside in. Most of my students have been foreign-born, I would guess, if I added them up over the years. I have students in senior positions in governments all over the world. So for me, it's would be pretty weird to be seeing things from a U.S. perspective. I know that when a senator or a congressman, and they really do prove your point about how hard it is to know whether they're idiots or whether because they're dumb on top of everything else in general. They're poorly educated, but they don't even know what they're talking about. They've never been to the places they're talking about. I have. They haven't. It's just unbelievable to listen to them. But I don't think that it's just conniving. I think it's deeply rooted in this self-superiority and in the channels of information. And my main recommendation in life, period, is talk to someone else. Go abroad, go listen, make connections. And my main advice on geopolitics is talk to the other side. The biggest stupidity of our age is there's no one to talk to. Well, this is partly a lie, but it's partly a misunderstanding. I get a lot of hate mail, I would say, from Israel right now, because I'm speaking out that what Israel is doing is completely ruthless and genocidal. And how can you say that, Mr. Sachs? Don't you know they're all out to kill us? And I say, well, you know, I was just in Egypt, and I was just in the Emirates, and I was recently in Saudi Arabia, and I was, and so forth, and they're not all out to kill you. Have you been to any of these places? No, I don't have to be in these places, because I know they're all out to kill us. So there's no human contact, and it seems that this is a pretty vital part of the story, actually. It's an old theory, Gordon Allport, in U.S. Race psychology, the contact theory. I think it's, you know, he stated it seems a little simple in the first statement of it, but I think there's truth to it, which is if you don't know, if you don't have the personal experience, you don't know that you don't know.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. So that brings me to a related question that I have.
We're gonna have to stop shortly because I have another call actually that started a few minutes ago.
Sure. So I'll make this the final question. So it was noted that in the previous discussion, also during that Athens Democracy Forum, you were interrupted when you started saying these things about Western society, which actually may reflect our society's reluctance to openly address these issues of race and white supremacy. So my question is, finally, why do you think that there is now a significant generational shift with younger, more diverse groups engaging more critically with these issues, particularly in the context of, for example, the protests for Gaza?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Clearly, many things are at work. One of them is intellectual discourse has been opened up in the last 50 years because really the discourse and the history was written almost entirely by the victors, and that is by white Anglo-Saxon professors and so forth. And that stopped being true, thank goodness. There's a lot of history that is coming from people who have been victimized or enslaved or genocided. And this is, students read these things, so the students are well aware of things. The fact that students read these things is now being attacked by the Congress in the United States wholeheartedly. How dare you we have our idiotic columnists in the New York Times telling us what students should read and so forth. And so there's a backlash against this. How dare you teach these things? How dare you teach white hate, they call it. It's not white hate, it's trying to explain the history of all of this. But students are much, much more aware of these issues because there's now been, it actually is almost a century of history being written by those who experienced it the hard way. In the United States, the greatest breakthrough in history writing, unbelievable, was W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction, because one African-American genius took on the entire academic establishment to rewrite American history, and he did it successfully because he was such a genius, and the history that was being told was such a lie. But we now have this with respect to Israel, for example. The story about Israel, has been rewritten by Israel's own historians, many of them chased out of the country afterwards, who are now, quote, in exile in a way, because they received such hate for exposing true history within the country. Second, obviously, is the student body itself is much more diverse. We have international student bodies, so this is invaluable. Invaluable for us, the faculty, and invaluable for the other students. And the third is the social media, which is you see things in front of your eyes, not screened by one national station or one broadcasting unit, or we used to have 3 in the United States. And this also shows, what idiots these people in Congress are in the United States. They decided, well, now we have to shut down TikTok. And it has nothing to do with China. They say it because they're also idiots that sometimes they even tell the truth. That students are seeing terrible things on TikTok in Gaza, so we have to close this down. So this is also part of what's happening. We have a much more open discourse, but the truth of the matter is it's not open enough, and we're edging towards World War III. And I don't know whether we're going to keep this under control, because in Europe and the United States, which are supposedly open societies, we have a completely, not completely, but almost completely closed mainstream media. It's absolutely alarming. And we have incredibly reckless politicians talking about nuclear war. Well, that's going to be a great way to put an end to our discussions, isn't it? This is really the biggest danger right now, which is that as this kind of white-dominated world comes to an end, this Western European, U.S.-dominated world comes to an end in the right way, which is through the rise to power and dignity and sovereignty of all parts of the world, how desperate will the U.S. be, or NATO, to hold its supposed illusory, delusional advantage? This is what we're in the midst of right now. This question.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll see a political version of the Planck principle, where science advances one funeral at a time. Maybe politics will do this.
Well, let's not do it one war at a time. We can't afford that. So we really need to make some breakthroughs, and I'm very proud of our students in helping that this year. It's the best we have. I'm a big believer that because we're interconnected so profoundly across the world in our fate, whether it is environment, climate, nuclear war, pandemic, you name it, national borders are not so meaningful as sometimes we think. But we got organized in a world of nation states, one that was largely built by European imperial powers in the 19th and 20th century. I believe we need global government, not as a sole government, obviously, but as a way to solve global problems. And this is an idea that is essentially 1 century old. We never had global institutions until the middle of the 19th century, starting with the telegraph and postal union, and the beginnings of global pandemic preparedness, we'd say now, but it was for infectious disease. That was the beginning in the 1850s, under European imperial domination and control. But even then, that wasn't really global government in any way. Then after World War I, the idea was to create a League of Nations, and that got started by the British and the U.S. In 1920-21, but the U.S. decided not to join. So it was kind of stillborn, and it didn't prevent World War II, obviously. Then in the middle of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, who's my favorite all-time president, said we need to try again with another organization. This time it ended not in Geneva, but on the East River, the United Nations. And it was born in 1945. It is only the second attempt in all of human history to have a universal body to address global scale issues. It's filled with problems. And one of the big problems is it was designed in a two-tiered way. 5 countries were given preeminence, that you can't do anything binding without their unanimous agreement. And that is the U.S., and it was originally the Soviet Union, China, which was originally the nationalist China, and Britain and France. So 5 powers, which we now call the P5, or the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, can veto anything that is binding and can block any change in the charter itself that is the constitution of the UN. And then at the same time, it's also a universal body, but it has a single chamber, a little bit like the Senate, in that each state in the U.S. gets 2 votes, but in the UN, each country gets 1 vote. And that's true whether you're Nauru, which is the smallest population of the 193 with 12,000 people, or China, or now actually, I should say, up-to-date India, which is now the most populous country, both China and India, 1.4 billion people. So they each get 1 vote. Now, this also has its problem, obviously, in terms of, is that the right mode of representation of people around the world? So I've been donating, I'd say, most of my time in the last 25 years to the UN. I am fully aware of all of the difficulties, contradictions, and so on. But I love the idea that 8 billion people through 193 representative national governments talk to each other at least.
Yeah.
I love the idea of the UN Security Council, and I testified a couple of times in the UN Security Council in the last 2 years. And I love the idea that in a civilized way, no one's shooting at each other in the room, except through their verbal statements. They're actually talking. Does it work great? No, obviously it does not work great. Could it be reformed? Absolutely. Again, we could have days of discussion of what to do. But what else are we going to do but to try to make it work and to understand that it's only the second attempt in the 300,000 years of our species to actually have global governance?
Yeah, and okay, well, that's, I suppose, puts it in perspective and explains why maybe new forms are required at some point. But you might say it's like democracy, the worst form of government except for all the rest. But
yeah, but it also needs to be fixed, and this is part of the job of the 21st century.
I'm itching to get to recent affairs, but I can't resist, maybe because of my training with Noam Chomsky early on. When you say, okay, Roosevelt, I mean, given the makeup, especially the P5, would you not say that the desire was not to have a world government, but to divvy up the world for U.S. and for major power control, and the UN was a sort of a legitimizing force to allow the U.S. to appear to have international goals when really it was trying to control its hegemony? I'm going to be the devil's advocate and say that.
No, I think at the time, Roosevelt, by the way, was really unusual in American leaders. He really was actually an anti-imperialist, and he really believed in economic rights, and he believed in human rights, and he was really an extraordinarily decent, unbelievably shrewd and effective and clever politician. So I really like him. From everything I've studied over the last 50 years, I like him. Complicated personality also, by the way, but I like him a lot. And I don't think that it was not to divvy up the world. He was no fan of the British Empire, which was the dominant empire up until the end of World War II. The United States became the dominant empire afterwards. But at a practical level, it was not actually to give control to the five. It was to give control to the one. The United States was going to largely run the show.
Exactly.
But had it been Roosevelt, it actually would have run the show in a quite decent way. It would have decolonized the world. It would have made for good neighbors in Latin America. It would have done things that Roosevelt truly believed in. He submitted in 1944 to the U.S. Congress an economic Bill of Rights. His wife, after Roosevelt's death, Eleanor Roosevelt, presided over the promulgation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was not a game. That was not a PR stunt. That was a very deeply moving, important step in our global evolution as humanity, to say that there are basic rights for all people as individuals around the world and their human dignity. Now, has the UN served all these high purposes? Not quite. But at the same time, the bodies that have been created by the UN, UNESCO for education, science, and culture, for ITU for international telecommunications, WHO for the World Health Organization, and many, many others, are actually led, people say by international bureaucrats, but they're led by people who really believe in the international mission. They're multicultural, multinational, and above any other institution I know, they take a global perspective, which is very hard because if you're in the U.S., you're almost bound, compelled to take a national perspective. Even if you're in a university, our universities are funded by the Defense Department. They're funded by the State Department. They're funded by government grants. My colleagues are often aghast at what I say because I don't take the U.S. government line. Partly, I'm not dependent on it, thank God. But, I find in the UN, the ethos really is different because people come from different countries. Now, the U.S. still, has its hand on things through its share of the budget and so forth. But truly, among all of our imperfect institutions, if you want to hear an international point of view, not just a national government point of view, the UN you're going to hear it much more in the UN than typically you'd even hear in an East Coast university of the United States.
Okay, absolutely. No doubt about that. The universities are not, okay, we won't get into that. But, and so this is a great segue because people might imagine, based on your comments about Roosevelt and the fact that you have been a quote unquote insider in many ways, that you hew the insider line. And we're going to spend the next few minutes, and not as much, anywhere near as much as I'd like, making it clear that you're not. We're going to talk about. I looked just at random at 9 pieces you've written, and we won't get through all 9, unfortunately. But they deal with Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, the CIA, U.S. foreign policy, in a way which, in almost every way, radically differs from the party line of what you'd hear in either mainstream media or in the U.S. government or in many other places. So let's talk about some things, and as I say, people should be prepared for arguments and discussions that are going to upset a lot of people, but it's important to have them, and I'm always impressed that you have the courage to state them. The first one is a framework, one you wrote in November 30th, early on, relatively early on after October 7th, a framework for peace in Israel and Palestine, where you argued right off that the only way to end this was to welcome Palestine as a UN member state. This might shock some people, that the first thing you do after what many people claim is an unprovoked, or at least certainly an unacceptable and horrific act of terrorism, to recognize Palestine as a UN member state, with pre 1967 borders, and why don't you just spend a few minutes talking about that?
Yeah, I think that there are two overarching issues I would say about all of my views. One is that any event is not really an event, it's part of a dynamic process. Okay. So you can never say, well, things started on October 7, Hamas made an attack, or that Putin, unprovoked, attacked Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. So whenever you see in the media, which you see all the time, unprovoked, it's phony. As a physicist, you would say, the world is governed by dynamical processes. They can have some uncertainties in them in the wave equation, or in Newtonian mechanics, we thought we were able to predict everything about the future from knowing the current state. But in any event, there are dynamics, and that is true. So never look at a snapshot. Always look at the dynamics. The second thing is there are two versions of the world, if I could simplify a little bit. The United States policy truly is that the U.S. should run the show. Mm-hmm. This is actually formal doctrine. If you read formal, boring doctrine, like the security strategy or defense strategy of the United States, or in the academic world, the grand strategy in the international relations literature of the United States is to be the predominant power. or sometimes called the hegemon, or sometimes called the unipolar country. I really disagree with that philosophically because we are 4.1% of the world population. Who the hell gave 4.1% of the world population the right to run the other 95.9% of the world population? That's absurd. So these are the two predicates of almost everything I do, which is say, what are the dynamics here? So how do you help to move a more complex, multidimensional dynamic system, if you want to put it that way? And second, don't take the U.S. line, take a global perspective, take a shared perspective. So when it comes to Israel and Palestine, there are two peoples, millions of each, on a common land. There is a long history of controversy about that going back to the Balfour Declaration. There are heated ideological arguments on both sides. There are both sides saying the other doesn't belong here at all. And this is fraught with all of the heat, emotion, deep religious beliefs, and many other things that are part of this conflict. But it also has meant perpetual war and perpetual cycles of war. And it has also meant, in my experience, in my view, tremendous suffering of the Palestinian people relative to the suffering of the Israeli Jewish people, because Israel, quote, won, and it has had the United States at its back, and the Palestinian people have suffered tremendously in this. Since 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel has occupied the West Bank and Gaza and part of the Golan Heights and so on. And I first went to Israel in 1972 in about the same, it was the same summer vacation after high school that I visited my East German pen pal. And I went to Israel for the first time, and I was told a phrase called facts on the ground. That we are going to put settlements into these occupied, conquered lands to make facts on the ground so that we'll always control those places. I was kind of innocent then. I didn't really understand the significance of it, but 52 years later, I came to understand much sooner than that this is going to be a recipe for profound unhappiness, injustice, and violence, and it has been. So I believe that those facts on the ground weren't quite so factual or clever as they said. There are now hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
700,000.
Yeah, and depending on where you draw lines and how you count, a couple 100,000 in East Jerusalem in some sense, or in the environment of East Jerusalem, another 500,000 away from Jerusalem. And that has created a lot of zealotry as well, because a lot of these settlers have a religious, deeply embedded.
Religious.
Yeah, exactly. And so they believe, well, God gave us this land and it's ours, and there's nothing more to say about it. So, to my mind, we've got to end this cycle of violence before it ends up killing everybody, including everybody in an escalating global war. And the way to do it is to divide the territory according to international law that has been promulgated for the last 57 years since the Six-Day War. And by international law, I mean votes of the UN Security Council principally, because that has said we need two states. It should be on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And it seems to me that this is what bargaining theory calls the focal point for the bargain. It's the only one that has a plausibility that can actually reach an outcome short of all-out war. And so there are people who say, well, we should have one state, or we should have a binational state, or we should have a democratic state. There are others who say there should be no Israel, wipe it off the map. There are those that say there should be no Palestine, wipe it off the map. I believe that the way to get this cycle of extreme violence and cruelty over is to implement international law. And I think it's going to happen, actually, that Palestine will become the 194th member of the United Nations. The U.S. is going to fight against this, but in the end, I don't think the U.S. can block this from happening. Israel, of course, is aghast at it.
Yeah.
So what?
You say Israel's aghast. I think it's important to point out the government of Israel is aghast.
Yeah, let me put it that way.
I'm not sure the public is.
No, you're right. I agree with you. I agree completely with you.
Now, I want to get to some key points which you make, which I think are interesting, that counter the general narrative. But one point I do want to say, people would counter you, say Israel isn't occupying Gaza because Israel removed itself in 2005 or so willingly, and it occupies the West Bank, but not Gaza. Would you at least agree with that, or no?
No, not at all.
Good.
If you have a prison and the guards guard the inmates going in and out of their cells, but they don't live inside the cells, I would say they're still occupying the prison.
Okay.
And so that's what Gaza is. I'm an economist. I'm not a conservation biologist or a specialist in your topic of integrative conservation. But I am working with the United Nations actively every day to try to implement the globally agreed goals that we have set for sustainable development. So I'm constantly wondering about and worrying about how we can actually achieve what we have set out to achieve. Now, the basic problem is that our institutional framework, our politics and our economic institutions are not aligned with sustainable development. They are not aligned with conservation. They are not aligned with stabilizing the climate. They are not aligned with protecting biodiversity. So we are in the middle of a crisis. The crisis has been underway for many decades. It's already more than 30 years since the world governments adopted 3 major environmental agreements. The first on climate change, the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And these were adopted back in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. We are more than 30 years later, and not one of these treaties is actually being implemented successfully. The reasons are complex, but the basic problem is that the international market economy and our geopolitical environment, the way that governments interact, does not lead to success so far. Time is also very short, because when we're dealing with biological conservation or climate change, it's not only a matter of delay, it's a matter of irreversibilities that we are facing. If we drive species to extinction, as far as we know, we're not going to recover them. If we exceed climate limits, we are not easily going to recover a safe climate. In both circumstances of ecosystem functioning and of the climate, and they're obviously related, we believe that there are tipping points beyond which we experience highly dangerous feedback effects and runaway effects that become irreversible. So when I say that we have lost time during the last 30 years, it's not merely that we have delayed the introduction of effective measures, we have also come closer to major irreversibilities. In the case of biological diversity, these irreversibilities include species extinction and the collapse of ecosystem functioning. When it comes to climate change, last year was 1.48 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. In other words, we have already reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015 to implement the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We will probably exceed the 1.5 degrees limit in 2024. Now, partly this is because of a short-term or interannual effect of El Nino, but the underlying upward trend of global warming has definitely accelerated, and we are now at a warming rate of about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So we're going to overshoot the 1.5 degrees, perhaps very seriously, and that could lead to irreversible disasters. The destruction of the ice sheets, or at least part of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, the slowing or even stopping of the ocean circulation, the thermohaline circulation, the melting of permafrost, and the massive release of methane and CO2 buried beneath the permafrost, and of course the loss of species that cannot migrate successfully in the context of a warming climate and which reach thermal limits beyond which they can't survive. And that's true of both plants and animals, and many alpine species which have been climbing up the mountainsides, but the mountains have peaks, and beyond that, the warming will lead to the destruction of the habitat of these species. In general, the world market economy does not send the right signals either for climate change or for biodiversity conservation. Markets do not incorporate the losses of natural capital in any direct way. These are, from an economic theory point of view, external effects that are not captured by market forces. And as much as we have discussed for the last 40 years, actually, these external effects, we have not succeeded in internalizing them or bringing them under control. Now, when it comes to biological diversity, I would say the challenge is even more complicated than the climate challenge. When it comes to the climate challenge, which includes the land use regulations, there is at least a pathway that can be identified for how the world's energy systems can be transformed in order to stop the CO2 emissions related to fossil fuel use, and when it comes to the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, at least a sketch of what needs to be done. When it comes to biological diversity, I would say that every biome, every ecosystem, every local land use environment presents its own challenges, which are very complex, which do not lend themselves to easy market-based solutions where one simply adjusts a market price, for example, and thereby creates an incentive that leads to the right outcomes. Because when we're talking about biological diversity, it's very hard to put a price on biological diversity. We don't easily correct the market failures that lead to the destruction of species and lead to the destruction of the functioning of the ecosystems. So when it comes to what to do, the challenges of biological conservation are extraordinarily complex. They cannot easily be summarized in the way that the climate agenda can be summarized. With the climate agenda, well, even there, of course, it's complex, but with the climate agenda, we say things like decarbonize the energy system by 2050, or reach net zero emissions by 2050. When we discuss the same issues with regard to biological diversity, we say protect a certain amount of land area, or stop or slow the destruction of habitat, or the extinction rates, and so on. But these are goals that are not easily turned into policies with effect. And so my own observation of these processes that I've been involved in a diplomatic level for the last 25 years on a daily basis is that both the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda are complicated, but I would say the biodiversity agenda is even more complicated and less successful in terms of any kind of public awareness, set of policies, or measures of implementation. I think it's right to say we are on a path that is designed typically in the relevant species, or the number of members of species, so the species abundance is in decline, whether it's fisheries or whether it's forests, or whether it's different classes of species, amphibians or pollinators or other groups. And we do not have effective mechanisms to address this decline that are actually working and operational. So what to do? My own approach, which I advocate for all issues, and I should say that when it comes to sustainable development, we're talking about not only the environmental crises, but also the social crises, the economic crises, the problems of extreme poverty. We have 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, after all. We have the climate crisis and so forth. My own view is that we need much more detailed specification of our objectives, of the ways to achieve them, and of their incorporation into national plans on a scientific basis, and then the identification of the policy instruments, whether it is economic incentives, regulation, land use, protected areas, and so forth, for how the scientifically specified objectives can be achieved, and then a systematic and frequent monitoring mechanism so that we are not simply meeting every 5 or 10 years to understand how bad things are going, but actually reporting almost in real time using extensive satellite data and ground truthing data so that we have a rapid feedback of data to confirm or disconfirm whether we are on the right track, and to enable not only monitoring and understanding the state of affairs, but also enforcement mechanisms that typically mean enforcement against illegal actions like illegal fishing or illegal clearing of forests or illegal use of scarce fresh water supplies and so forth. So planning, incentive structures, and monitoring mechanisms are all essential. I know that in a sense this exists in the area of biological diversity because the Kunming-Montreal Protocol is supposed to do this, but it is extremely weak. I can go an entire year without hearing one policymaker or one ambassador or one finance minister even mention the Convention on Biological Diversity, much less discuss how it is being enforced or implemented or incentivized. I hear almost nothing about this agenda at the UN or among policy makers. So you are the scientists and the experts, but I can tell you it is not in the active domain of the policy community. Now, I do also need to stress that even the climate agenda, which is much more visible, is also not being implemented because, well, it raises a number of questions, which I'll mention briefly. But the biodiversity agenda is way down on the list of awareness, of priority, of budgets, and of specific mechanisms for implementation. And it's more complicated because there aren't simple rules of what to do. These policies need to be implemented with a tremendous local knowledge everywhere. So only local ecologists can save their own local ecosystems because outsiders don't know, don't care, and are not in a position to set policies and plans for success. One more basic point that I want to emphasize, and then I'll talk about a couple of the obstacles, and then we can open it up for discussion. Whether it is the climate agenda or whether it is the biodiversity agenda, regional cooperation between neighboring countries is typically essential. And everything that I've said about how hard this is involves another level of difficulty, which is active cooperation among neighboring countries. Governments do not work very well together in a detailed way on just about anything, but in the areas of shared biomes, a shared river system, a shared forestry, a shared fisheries, cooperation sometimes exists on paper, but in practice it's quite limited. Usually in a rivershed, the upstream countries do what they want, and the downstream countries try to adjust to the consequences. When it comes to fisheries, the illegal fishing is pervasive. Fleets come in and they hope to avoid detection. They catch the fish and they leave. But enforcement is very weak. When it comes to shared forest regions, it is very hard to get agreements on a shared forest biome to limit deforestation or logging, especially of highly valued tropical forest products. And so regional cooperation is both vital and difficult. This is true also in the climate area on energy transformation. In general, a low-carbon energy system requires interconnections across national borders because when it comes to intermittent energy sources like wind, solar, and hydro, it's better to connect those in a large grid to reduce the variability by smoothing across a number of different sources rather than having one country at a time make its own energy system. But getting that kind of regional grid requires a lot of political trust, a lot of market organization, a lot of shared regulation, and so on. All of this is made complicated by our geopolitical environment. The United States is a very bad behavior, in my view, right now. The U.S. government is more interested in its power, its military advantage, its dominance, than it is in sustainable development. I almost never hear a constructive word coming out of Washington about these topics. The only thing Washington is interested in is war, the military, and competition with China and competition with Russia. And this is all extremely short-sighted and dangerous and nasty, I have to say. So the geopolitical environment is also extremely difficult. Now, finally, let me just say what a world should be doing. And when it comes to land use and biodiversity, let me emphasize a very basic point, which you know, which is that sustainable management of ecosystems is critical both for the climate goals as well as for the biodiversity goals, because around 1/3 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change, deforestation, and unsustainable forms of agriculture. And so this means that if we're going to address the climate agenda, we intrinsically need to address the conservation agenda. We need to stop deforestation. We need to protect the ecosystem functions because they not only contribute directly to the biodiversity objectives, but they also contribute to the climate objectives, and of course, they're fundamental for many other objectives as well, for public health, for example, for access to safe water supplies, and so on. So this agenda of sustainable land use, conservation, and ecosystem protection is a pervasive objective, but it is a difficult one. It's difficult scientifically, and it's very difficult to implement. The first thing that I have always wanted to see is a rigorous approach to land use planning that satisfies the needs of biological diversity conservation. My guru was the wonderful scientist Edward Wilson, who was a teacher of mine and a friend and a colleague, and he said, protect half the earth. And I always wanted to know which half. Where do we draw the lines? How do we determine this? For each country, can we show on a map where agriculture and cities can be and where the protected areas should be designated? I want the scientists to help us understand this. This obviously intersects very closely with the agriculture challenges. So ecologists and agronomists need to be working intimately together, because the biggest challenge to biodiversity is probably the agriculture sector. It's the extension of farmlands, croplands, pasture lands. It's the drainage of water for irrigation. Agriculture is the great driver of land use change and of unsustainability and biodiversity loss. And yet the agronomists and the conservationists tend to view each other as enemies rather than as colleagues for how to actually draw the right maps to say, here's what can be done here and here's what should not be done here. Now, suppose we had an ideal map of the world that identified where the reserves should be, where agriculture should be under different conditions, how the rivershed should be used, how the fisheries should be controlled, and so forth. Suppose we knew that by the magic of ecological sciences, we would then face the question, how could such a vision actually be implemented? Because it would not be consistent with market forces. Market forces would say, chop down those trees and grow palm oil, deforest and open up more pasture land, and so forth. So the incentive questions become very crucial. Once we know what to protect, then we need a structure how to protect them. Let me just observe that we do not have even a basic incentive structure for conservation almost anywhere in the world. There is almost no active valuation of ecosystem services. There is no funding to keep forests standing. There is very little enforcement of mechanisms like tradable quotas for fisheries. Forests are routinely chopped down, even when they are designated as reserved areas, because illegal logging is quite profitable typically. I was taken a few years ago in Borneo, in Kalimantan, to a protected region, and all I saw for 50 kilometers was trucks carrying out giant tropical logwoods on their way to the Chinese market. So it was completely being deforested, but in name it was a protected area. So we need incentive structures and enforcement structures that don't exist. There are basically, there are several kinds of tools that in principle could be used. We could be paying communities to protect the nature, even paying indigenous communities, for example, to be active stewards and guardians of their ecosystems. We could be paying to keep land areas intact rather than utilized. But the funding for that barely exists at the international level in any scale. So we have demonstration projects, small scale projects, but we don't have anything like the scale of resources that would be needed for this kind of protection. Another kind of regulation is to enforce rules of sustainability within global supply chains. So a buyer of tropical logwoods would have to certify that the source of those logs is a sustainable source, or the purchaser of soybeans from Brazil would have to certify that the soybeans did not come from a deforested margin of the Amazon, and so forth. And Europe is trying to introduce such supply chain rules. They're very rudimentary, and most of the supply side countries, whether it's the Southeast Asian countries that provide palm oil, or whether it is the South American countries that provide feed grains and meat products, resist this kind of regulation. They don't want it, they don't like it, and so really implementing this kind of sustainable supply chain rule, I think, is promising but very difficult. Then comes the enforcement issue. Almost any of these mechanisms is subject to cheating and subject to illegal activities. And in order to enforce such agreements, there needs to be policing, and there needs to be very active monitoring. I think one of the most important good points is that with satellite data, we can have daily monitoring. In fact, we can create real-time data on where deforestation is taking place, or where ships are where they should not be in fishery zones and so on. So we have the capacity for monitoring that is much, much greater than it was ever before, because it can be done remotely and digitally, but still we haven't implemented such systems in a detailed way. So maybe I'll pause here just to say we're running out of time. We need the scientists to say, here is what to do. Here are the rules that could actually be put in place. Then economists like myself can probably help by coming along and saying, here are incentive structures or regulations or financial mechanisms that can help to enforce what you, the conservation biologists, have identified as the substantive need in order to achieve the conservation goals that the world has set. Then, of course, we have the ultimate issue of trying to get the attention of our governments. For me, in the United States, this is especially hard because my government is especially nasty, I would say, incompetent and corrupt. And so it's rather difficult to get their attention because they're much more interested in war than they are in peace, and they're much more interested in unilateralism than they are in cooperation. But we have to try. So this is maybe where I'll stop and turn it back over to you for discussion. Well, first of all, agreements always need to be implementable, monitorable, and no agreement is 100% secure. And by the way, there is no perfect security in this world or in this universe.
Yeah.
And so Israel doesn't get perfect security when the rest of us live under insecurity of many kinds. Everybody faces, as I think it's the second law of thermodynamics, everybody faces insecurity. We all face entropy. We all face, we all face all of the uncertainties and principles of degradation. You have to keep building in order to keep order. So this is the first point. The second point is that this is a political process, mostly among nation states, in my opinion, which is we need the major countries to operate responsibly under the UN Charter. And that means Saudi Arabia needs to sign on, Iran needs to sign on, Egypt needs to sign on, Jordan needs to sign on, UAE needs to sign on, Qatar needs to sign on. Now, I talk to those diplomats all the time. They will sign on, actually.
Iran will sign on?
Iran has signed on repeatedly to what's called the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 and to the Arab Islamic Declaration in Riyadh in November 2023. Unfortunately, the New York Times doesn't carry these stories, by the way. So if you get your news from the New York Times, you're not getting your news. Listen to Lawrence Krauss instead. You'll get much better news.
Or Jeffrey Sachs is probably better. But anyway, okay. And one of the things you bring out in that regard, and by the way, I should say, you're writing, it's really the failure of journalism of late in the last bunch of mainstream journalism has really been a problem. But we don't have time for that. But some people would argue that, and the hardliners in Israel argue, peace, but after we destroy Hamas. Hamas is a threat to the Israeli nation, and we'll first destroy Hamas and kill everyone, and then negotiate. Now, I will say that's kind of a policy that in general hasn't worked well. I mean, I was sympathetic to it because those people are crazy, but there's 2 points that one that you haven't raised, the one that occurred to me immediately, is that was the same argument that we have sort of applied in Afghanistan and Iraq, and all it did was result in massive destruction and death of the population, and never solved the problem. Iraq and Afghanistan never solved the problem to claim you're going to destroy the terrorists, then everything will go away. That's the first question. But the other thing you point out is that Hamas really has never had the capability of destroying the Israeli nation. In fact, killed very few people per year compared to some extent, you would argue Israel attacks on Palestine. So maybe you could comment on both those.
Well, just on the second point, the UN data, which I trust, shows that the civilian deaths from Palestinian attacks, civilian Israeli deaths, I should say, from Palestinian attacks, averaged 6 per year between 2007 and 2021. Now, 6 per year, you could say, is sad, but unfortunately, in my neighborhood in New York, it's a greater number, no doubt. We have shootings on both ends of our block, stabbings, other things. It's come on, real life. Let's get real. Hamas does not have an air force. Hamas does not have tanks. Hamas does not have anything that truly threatens Israel. Do I believe in manning a border with Gaza? Yes, I do. Do I think that Israel let its guard down on October 7? Absolutely. But does Hamas threaten Israel? No. By the way, does Iran threaten Israel? Yes. Of course it does. That's true of countries around the world. We're all threatened. We have nuclear-armed countries. Iran's not nuclear-armed. It could be.
It could
at some
be because
point.
we may let them. Yeah.
There's no security in that way other than diplomacy. The idea that you eradicate all your foes is some kind of comic book description of the world, which
in fact,
it does not exist.
It does not exist. And one of your wonderful articles is diplomacy is the only way to solve the world problems. And it's sort of you point out diplomacy has disappeared when it comes to U.S.-Russia relations, U.S.-China relations. And, I was just actually listening, and I'm going to have a podcast with someone who's involved in super communication, who points out that negotiations, something that doesn't, certainly one of the people at least, and maybe both people who are running for president don't seem to get, that negotiations in the end have to be win-win. They can't be win-lose. That you don't go to a negotiation to get what you want and the other person loses everything. It never works. It never works.
One of the great lines of the late Shimon Peres, an Israeli leader, was you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. You don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with your enemies. That's the whole point, to find the mutual accommodation so that both sides survive. That's not so hard, but when you actually watch the diplomacy now, as I do hour by hour, the U.S. line is our friends and allies, our friends and allies. That's who we talk to, our friends and allies. Well, talk to the other side, damn it! Come on, because that's where the issue is.
That's all sensible, and again, I'm sorry to keep cutting in, but we don't have much time. Otherwise, I'd let you go on but you have said something that people you have used the word apartheid and genocide when you talk about Israel, and I know I've heard people like Douglas Murray recently saying, look, there's a war, and Israel is not. The genocide is an interesting thing. Are you systematically trying to destroy a population? And the argument is that war, and it's certainly, for example, in the U.S. war in Iraq, for many more, 500,000 to 1 million people were killed versus 30,000. I never heard the term genocide applied there. Maybe it should have been, but it wasn't. What's the difference? Why are you willing to use that word?
Well, the difference is it's not just me, by the way. There's a case before the International Court of Justice brought by South Africa. And the long part of the brief of South Africa, which people can find online, is the intent. Because under the 1948 Genocide Convention, the question of intent is crucial. And Israeli leaders like Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir, who are two cabinet ministers of great importance in the current government of Netanyahu are so vulgar in their statements and in what they've said that you look at it and say, oh my God, the intent is there. Now, shame on them. I think when they speak Hebrew to their followers, they don't think anyone's listening. But in this day, everyone's got a mobile phone, everyone's taping and posting everything. So we're hearing all of this stuff. We didn't hear in Iraq statements by the U.S. As much as I hated that war, so don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I thought that war was so stupid, misguided, and on phony print. But actually, Cheney did not say, as far as I know, we need to kill every one of those Iraqis, or we need to push the Iraqis out of Iraq. Or Iraq is ours, given to us by God.
No, he might have said the latter. I'm not sure, but
I know he may have said the oil was ours. I don't think he said it was given to us by God. But in any event, he did not say the things that the Israeli leaders, I think, not realizing the whole world is listening, have said to their followers. So this is the intent question.
But the question is, on the troops on the ground are they intentionally murdering and killing Palestinians? The leaders are nuts. A lot of them will agree with that.
Yeah, the leaders have sent the leaders have sent the soldiers in.
In the recent times, when seeing the public in Israel finally, or maybe not finally, but effectively mobilizing against their leaders, right?
Yeah, the leaders have sent the Israeli Defense Forces into Gaza and have given an assignment and mission which is horrific and, I believe, in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. For example, the starvation of hundreds of thousands of people is not a rhetorical flourish, it's an immediate reality. Okay, you don't starve hundreds of thousands of people. You don't. Under any circumstances, any form of war, and not be subject to the Genocide Convention. So the leaders are giving orders, and the leaders need to change their orders. And right now, I believe that Israel is extremely vulnerable. I think likely it will be found in violation of the Genocide Convention.
In fact, yeah, one of the things we don't have time for is you basically said one of your articles is saving Israel by ending its war in Gaza. It's the only way to save Israel, you think, is ultimately ending that. And I hope that's the case. But that allows me a segment. I mean, in 10 minutes, I want to talk. It's not fair. I want to talk about two things you meant. One is the other boiling brew is Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is a remarkable piece by you on U.S. foreign policy is a scam built on corruption. Let's go to Ukraine, and then let's go to foreign policy in general and the corruption of also you talk about the CIA, and there are facts in there that are remarkable and damning. It's really compelling reading, and I recommend people read it. But look, one of the things you said about Ukraine is something that, again, I actually posted one of your pieces on my Substack site because it seems to me so eminently reasonable, and I can't understand why people don't recognize there's no way to win. There's no way that Ukraine is going to defeat Russia in the sense of, there's no way that war is going to end. It's just going to keep going and going unless there are some discussions. But you do point out two things. One, which a lot of people, of course, disagree with, but a lot of it, that Russia was provoked, at least, by the U.S. reneging on its agreements regarding NATO, which it clearly did. And the other three things, which I think are worth raising in the public's recognition: reneging on NATO, the overthrow, the coup in 2014, and the U.S. efforts to sabotage agreements that would have produced a diplomatic end to the war. So why don't you spend 4 or 5 minutes talking about that?
Yeah, I think that the main thing, and all of these points are related, the CIA, the U.S. foreign policy, and Ukraine. If people want to understand this war, just read one article. Read Zbigniew Brzezinski's article in Foreign Affairs in 1997 called A Eurasia Strategy. Brzezinski, of course, was a very senior international strategist for the U.S. and Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. Very clever. I liked him very much personally, and he helped very much on Poland's transformation. So I appreciated him very much. Very smart, by the way. But his view was we need to corner Russia and weaken Russia and make Russia a second-rate or third-rate power, or Russia maybe will fall apart like the Soviet Union fell apart. I think it was Brzezinski's Polish fervor also with its anti-Russian history that helped animate those views. But 1997, he spelled it all out. NATO's going to expand. NATO is going to expand into the Black Sea. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a great power. He spelled that out also in a book called The Global Chessboard the same year. This is it. This has been playing out now for a quarter century. And for Russia, well, that's an existential threat. It would be like China declaring, some clever Chinese analyst saying, well, China needs to contain the U.S., which is obviously anti-China, so we're going to put bases in Mexico, Venezuela, the Bahamas, throughout the Caribbean region, Canada, and so forth, and we'll tell the U.S. we're peace-loving and not to worry about it, but that's what we're going to do. Now, that's what we did vis-a-vis Russia. Russia said, no, please don't do that. Don't surround us. We don't want you all over our territory. They kept saying that. And the Europeans, I know, because they told me, he said, you know, your guy, George W. Bush, yeah, he's a little out of control. We don't need this NATO push in 2008 to Ukraine. This is gonna go badly. Someone today sent me from an advisor of Jacques Chirac some advice to Chirac in 2006, I think it is, where Chirac says, we don't really want a war with Russia over this. So we walked into this. We thought we could do this without Russia objecting, or if they objected, so what? Or if they actually tried to resist, we would always win. We're the United States. We're the greatest power in the world. Russia's a pipsqueak. Russia's a gas station with nuclear weapons, as the phrase went. And basically, we walked into this, and for Russia, this was an existential threat. We don't want to be surrounded by the United States. And by the way, it wasn't just Ukraine, it's also the country of Georgia. Look at a map. How the hell could anyone say that that's a North Atlantic country, or that's a country that's going to shape the security of the North Atlantic states? That is a country that happens to be on the eastern border of the Black Sea, part of America's idea of surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And note, one of the reasons why the Black Sea counts so much is that Russia has had its naval fleet in Sevastopol since 1783. And so the Black Sea is not just some incidental beachfront for Russia. It's absolutely fundamental. We walked into this when the Ukraine government said, maybe we don't want this is going to get us into a mess. We overthrew that government in 2014.
Something that's very important. People, you never hear about that. And
of course you don't hear about it. And so all of this has a history of recklessness, of upping the ante, of playing a weak hand. And the hand is weak for a reason that Obama did recognize, and I give him credit for this. he recognized back in 2015, he used the expression actually, or an expression like it, escalatory dominance, that they could keep raising the stakes up to nuclear war. And in the end, we can't trump that. For us, it's, this is a good geopolitical play. If we get away with it and get NATO there, great, it's great, but it's not existential for us. The U.S. doesn't depend on Ukraine being in NATO or the U.S. having bases there, but for Russia, it's existential. And Obama realized, well, they've got nukes. They're gonna play their existential hand, where for us, it's a matter of convenience. I think most of the American strategists are stupid, by the way. I mean it in an intellectual sense. They don't think ahead. I'm, by the way, extremely unimpressed with most of our generals. Of course, I'm not talking about their military insights. I'm talking about their diplomatic ideas, because generals their job is not diplomacy. Yeah. Their job is to fight a battle. Maybe they know something about that, so though sometimes you wonder. But when you put generals out in front of our policies, this is an absolutely wrong-headed approach. It's not their job.
We have a general as a member of the cabinet right now.
It's not their job. They don't get this stuff. Their job is weapons procurement or some strategy on a battlefield.
Why don't you just one minute talk about that? You mentioned 2014, but I think it's important people to know that there was willingness to have a diplomatic solution early on in the conflict with Ukraine, and
by the way,
which U.S. scuttled.
Russia wanted to have diplomacy for 30 years. That I know for sure. I know it firsthand for sure. And we always said, no, we're the United States. We don't need to talk with you.
Yeah.
This is the basic idea. And then when Russia and Ukraine actually negotiated an end to the war 2 months after it started, in Ankara, Turkey, with Turkish mediation, the U.S. stopped it. Give me a break. I'm telling you, they're not clever, these people. They're playing a lousy hand the wrong way. They keep raising the stakes. It's obvious that this isn't going to work. I've written about it for years, that it's just going to fail, aside from whatever one's views are.
Whether it's going to, how it's going to fail is unusual, but just looking at this, saying, how could this conflict ever end except for diplomacy? It just seems impossible. This statement that we got to keep arming, we got to keep fighting, all it does is kill more people, and in the end, if it's gonna end in any other way than Armageddon, it's got to end by people talking. I mean, I just don't see if you asked a 6-year-old, in fact, Chomsky once said to me, if you ask a 5-year-old something, it's obvious to them, then it probably is true, but it's amazing how our leaders, how we hear the opposite when.
I sometimes say, and I'm always corrected by my wife when I say it, I say they act like children, and my wife says, no, the children act better, because these people are operating on a news cycle and spin. They are not thinking what we call it sub-game perfection in game theory. How's this going to play out?
You talk about game theory, and I wish we had time to talk about that, because that negotiation is a big question of game theory, and how to when no one can win, how to ultimately have a game end effectively.
Well, one thing I'll say about game theory that I think is scientifically interesting and valid. Most game theory, what's called non-cooperative game theory, is you don't talk to the other side in game theory.
Yeah.
There is no communication. Yeah. And the famous prisoner's dilemma, where you show that the two sides end up in a non-cooperative mode, even though cooperation would be better for them, is this formalization where the story is that the prisoners are locked by their interrogators in separate rooms so that they're not allowed to communicate. But in our world, I keep saying to the White House, damn it, use my Zoom if you want, but call Putin. You know, don't think you're locked in a separate room because we can talk with each other.
The non-cooperative games actually only, you're right, only work without communication, and the communication interface is that. Let me end with a question related to one of your U.S. policies, scam, build, and corruption. Something that would amaze me. U.S. military-linked outlays in 2024 will come to around $1.5 trillion, or roughly $12,000 per household. Ultimately, the argument there, which is not new, is that foreign policy is really not being based on logic or altruism, as often said, or even necessarily effective self-interest of the country. It's based on self-interest of people who are making a lot of money. So, Ukraine, there is a rational argument for sending weapons to Ukraine if the people controlling that discussion are the people who are making money by the sale of weapons. Coming back to something that Eisenhower, I think he was the first person to use the word military-industrial complex. It's not new.
1961 farewell address.
Yeah, and so are we seeing? Is that at the root of this problem, ultimately?
Yes. Our problem started in 1947 with the National Security Act, which turned the U.S. into a security state, meaning that it is a state dominated by security considerations, the military, secrecy, the CIA as an operative secret army, and what happened over time, a network of 800 overseas military bases in 80 countries.
80 countries.
You know, you've got a lot of hardware all over the world. You've got a lot of military personnel all over the world. This is a huge, lucrative enterprise, and it is, it's about $1 trillion in direct military Pentagon outlays, and you add in the CIA, you add in Homeland Security, you add in veterans costs, which are enormous. That's if you want, you can attribute a piece of the debt to all of these wars and the debt service. $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, $1.5 trillion is a reasonable expression of this. Boy, that's a hell of a lot of money, it funds so many university institutes. It funds so many think tanks. It funds so many individuals. It advertises so much in the mainstream media. This is America's big business. It's not the only one.
The racket, as you point out.
Yeah,
it's a racket.
It's a racket, and we got a lot of spokesmen for it, and a lot of, as I say, the universities are deeply implicated, unfortunately, because they get a lot of money from this.
Yeah.
And you look at where we get our information. Check out the donor box. Check out your donors in Congress on opensecrets.org, and you can begin to see how this racket works.
दोस्तों इस वीडियो में मैं आपको वीडियो किस तरह से वीडियो जूम करते हैं और जूम आउट करते हैं। दोस्तों आपने कई जगह देखा होगा जिसमें आपने वीडियो को जूम इन और जूम आउट करके देखा होगा किसी की वीडियो में, तो वो बहुत ही आसान तरीका है। अगर आप इस वीडियो को पूरा देखेंगे तो आपको बहुत ही अच्छे तरीके से समझ आ जाएगी और आप बहुत ही अच्छे तरीके से किसी भी वीडियो को जूम आउट या जूम इन करना सीख जाओगे। इसके लिए आपको वीडियो पूरी देखनी पड़ेगी, तभी आपको समझ आएगी। और अगर वीडियो आपको अच्छी लगे तो आपने वीडियो को लाइक कर देना है और कमेंट में बताना है कि और इस टॉपिक से रिलेटेड आपको कौन सी वीडियो चाहिए। तो मैं आपको पूरी कोशिश करूँगा समझाने की वीडियो को किस तरह से जूम इन या जूम आउट किया जाता है। तो आपने इस वीडियो पर बने रहना है ताकि आपको वीडियो की पूरी समझ आ सके। चलते हैं वीडियो की तरफ। मैं आपको वीडियो जूम इन और जूम आउट करना सिखाऊंगा, तो आप अपने अच्छे तरीके से बने रहना है। और काइन मास्टर में आपको इतने अच्छे तरीके से समझाऊंगा कि आपको कोई भी ये नहीं सिखा पाए। दोस्तों इसके लिए आपको मीडिया में जाना है, अपने फाइल सेलेक्ट करनी है जो आपको जिसमें आपको وہ کرنا ہے، یہ اس پر سلیکٹ کرنا ہے۔ اس کے بعد دوستو جو ویڈیو آپ کو زوم ان یا زوم آؤٹ چاہیے کرنی ہے وہ ویڈیو کرنی ہے۔ جیسے کہ دوستو میں یہ ویڈیو کرنا چاہتا ہوں، یہ دوستو ویڈیو میں نے لے لی۔ اب دوستو اس ویڈیو کو میں زوم کرنا چاہتا ہوں تو میں کس طرح سے کروں گا؟ سب سے پہلے آپ کو کیا کرنا ہے، اسی ویڈیو کو سلیکٹ کرنا ہے، سلیکٹ کر لیا۔ اس کے بعد دوستو کیا کرنا ہے، اس کے بعد آپ کو دوستو اس طرح سے کرنا ہے، بیچ والے میں لگانا ہے دوستو، اس میں یہ دوستو اب غور سے دیکھتے جانا ہے تاکہ آپ کو اس پر دوستو آپ نے کلک کرنا ہے۔ کلک کرنے کے بعد دوستو آپ نے اب کیا کرنا ہے، اب آپ کو زوم ان اگر کرنی ہے دوستو، آپ کو کوئی پارٹ کرنا ہے یا جو بھی کرنا ہے آپ کو زوم کرنے کے لیے دوستو اوپر والے کو لگانا ہوگا۔ جو بھی آپ کو کرنا ہے یہ پارٹ لے لیا، اس کے بعد آپ نے ادھر کٹ لگا لینا ہے۔ اب جو ایسا آپ کو چاہیے، سوری آپ کو کٹ لگانا بھی سکھا دیں، جو آپ کو ایسا چاہیے دوستو۔ اس کے لیے اگر آپ کو اسپیسیفک حصہ چاہیے جس سے آپ نے وہ لگانا ہے، زوم ان یا زوم آؤٹ کرنا ہے، اس کے لیے آپ کو کیا کرنا ہوگا، آپ نے اس کے لیے ویڈیو کو سلیکٹ کرنا ہوگا، ٹھیک ہے۔ اب کوئی سا بھی پارٹ لے لیں، مثال کے طور پر میں یہ والا پارٹ لے لوں تو اس کو آپ نے کاٹ دینا ہے، مثال کے طور پر اس پر آپ نے لگا دینا ہے، اس پر دوستو، ٹھیک ہے دوستو، اس پر لگا دینا ہے اور اب بیچ میں سے آپ نے کاٹ دینا۔ اب جو آپ کو چاہیے پھر آپ نے وہیں پر جانا، اب سپیسیفک حصہ جو آپ کو چاہیے، ٹھیک ہے۔ اب یعنی کہ میں نے یہ لے لیا، اب اس کو زوم ان کرنا ہے، یعنی کہ آپ کو قریب کرنا ہے دوستو، آپ ویڈیو کو بہت زیادہ قریب کریں تو آپ نے اوپر والے کو سلیکٹ کرنا ہے اور ویڈیو کو یہاں سے جتنا اندر تک لینا چاہتے ہیں دوستو، یہاں سے یہاں پر دوستو آپ نے کرنا ہے، اس جگہ پر دوستو آپ نے زوم ان یا زوم آؤٹ کرنا ہے، ٹھیک ہے دوستو۔ اب آپ نے زوم ان کرنا ہے،